Right, there we are. Always a bit of a hesitation there. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our US Future 5 snapshot. I guess by Future 5, we mean trends. My name is Martin Raymond. I'm co-founder of the Future Laboratory, which some of you will know is a strategic consultancy that specializes in, well, I guess a unique blend of trend forecasting.
Consumer insight.
Foresight. Indeed.
Brand strategy.
Yeah.
And innovation for clients around the world.
And you probably are ready better. I'm joined by Fiona Harkin. Yeah, I said it again, it's Fiona, because I should know this because you're Irish and I'm Irish.
Yeah.
Okay.
It ends up as Fiona.
Fiona, who is the foresight editor of the Future Laboratories LSN Global, which, do you know what it stands for?
It's the
Lifestyle News Network. Okay, so thank you all for joining us today. We're going to be looking at, well, 5 trends, 4 of which will be covered in some depth. The 5th one, which I think it's a report we're launching later in the year, actually later in February, which really looks at the changing state of work and not workplaces, as a lot of people think about, work states, which...
Yeah, it's our first macro trend of 2023, and I think it's very timely as the back to office or remote working argument reigns supreme.
Which side are you on? Are you back to, or are you?
It's got to be a hybrid of both.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Forward.
I think it's funny how people are pushing us back to make a decision when actually the decision has already been made.
It has. The change has already happened. But if you want to chat to Martin, myself, or one of the team, or to find out more about LSN Global, the network, then do email us on hello@thefuturelaboratory.com.
It is hello. Coming up, we're going to be looking at collegiate nostalgia. So those of you who think about college and what happened there, sometimes many years ago, quite big at the moment, back in fashion. We're going to be looking at next level hedonism. So I wonder what the last level was about.
Oh, this is beyond, yeah.
Okay, so that's the next bit coming up. The awe economy, which I'm going to do a little, if you can, you must. I've just interviewed for a podcast, quite a fascinating look at why awe, not just extraordinary awe, but everyday awe is something that we now need to start cultivating. And of course, a bit that, I guess, timely with what's happening on Facebook, social media, this notion of anti-provocation platforms. I think you're going to be looking at that.
Yeah.
Okay. So
after we've shared today's overview of these 5 trends with you, we'll open up the conversation for a live Q&A. And thank you to all of you who've already submitted lots of questions.
Quite a lot of questions, amazingly so, yes.
And we'll be joined online throughout today's event by Jaylene, who's our Junior Marketing Manager.
And Jaylene will be sharing links with us today and also helping us respond to any live questions as they come in. So if you have questions, just place them into the chat box and hopefully we'll be able to get around to answer them at the end of the presentation. It's quite a packed agenda.
Yes. Yeah.
So we will
let's get
going. But before we do, platform first, explain to people what they're likely to find on the network.
So for those of you who don't know about LSN Global, we publish over 100 in-depth articles a month. And that's 100 macro articles annually. We cover 10 sectors. And we allow you access to 50 trends, foresight and sector specialists. We work and tap into over 1,000 experts and innovators and cultural navigators. And that's via our Futures 1000 expert network.
It is 1,000. These are all of the people that the team interview daily and weekly on the network. So for that alone, it's certainly worth checking out the kind of benefits and features that you're likely to find there. So quite a lot of them. I'm not going to go through everything on the slide here, but if you see, a lot of it is aligned towards doing strategy work, thinking about how you answer questions. So you have a trend, you have the foresight, and then beneath that you have what I call the solution journey. And really that's what we're trying to get people to understand, is that trends in themselves are pretty useless in some ways. They're also free if you spend a lot of time on the internet. The real, I guess, insight or depth to it is understanding where they fit in the culture and how you can best harness them.
Yeah, it's how they can be used for you. And so whether you're coming to LSN with a project mind state, whether you're tapping into it weekly, daily, you will find something to answer your problems and your challenges.
And it is, I guess, there's a lot of that. I mean, one of the things that we're asking about is how, for example, markets are changing. So if you think about some of the things we're going to be looking at, pleasure coming back in, but in a different context, introspection. So despite the fact that we have a lot of issues about cost of living, people are rethinking health, well-being, but also how they engage with pleasure and fun in a different way. And also this notion of experimentation. It's not all about drugs. This is the thing, there's quite a lot of things happening that allow us to engage and experiment in a much more open, health-focused, well-being manner.
Yeah, for sure. And as we'll see, Gens A and Z and early millennial citizens, note the word citizens there, they're rewriting the rules of how we define these words: pleasure, introspection, experimentation, and the associated trends around them.
I mean, citizens, I guess, was an interesting one, because when we were chatting to experts, this was a term a lot of them were using instead of consumers. So it was more proactive, more about being an activist, but also about participating. Exactly, like it's a collaborative, conversational, collegiate engagement, rather than something that was where you were subjective or looking at things as a consumer, rather than somebody who was a willful participant. Okay.
So against this backdrop of increased tensions in global and domestic markets, today we're presenting a cross-section of trends that capture these contradictions and these market contrasts. We've got culture wars, gender wars, climate wars, and these continue to push brands into making increasingly politicized and ethical decisions.
I mean, that was, I think, the crucial thing, the ethical nature of how people were expecting brands to behave, but also how a lot of people, Gen Z particularly, were expecting brands to be more political and politicized. So that's a good insight to kind of take on board. The second bit, which surprised me, because a lot of the time I'm told Gen Z are not really interested in credit or credit spending compared to, say, millennials. What we were finding is that quite a lot of Gen Z were now turning onto credit as a way to tough out the current cost of living prices.
Well, it's NFT values on buy now, pay later finances. So they might have to. Yeah,
to do it. But it was interesting that, again, the evidence initially suggests one thing, but when you dig into it and you speak to Gen Z citizens, to get that term right, they're seeing credit in a much different, more, I guess, proactive and more positive way. Where millennials are disengaging, these people are moving back into it. Okay, so let's just look at some of the trends we're going to be covering today. The first one, obviously, is our work states, not workplaces. Second one is
collegiate nostalgia.
Anti-provocation platforms, which is the one that intrigues me. The awe economy, and finally,
next level hedonism.
Hedonism. I'm liking this whole different shift in how we're beginning to understand pleasure.
So, as I mentioned before, work states futures is our first macro trend of 2023, and you're most welcome to sign up for the webinar event discussing this report on the 15th of March.
So it's a free event, and it really looks at this in more in depth. So one of the things we're beginning to see is what we're calling the 5 drivers of this trend. So we're going to give you a little taste of the woke force, which is about how half of the workers we questions are looking at what they call the purpose of work. So the purpose of work in their lives. It's quite fascinating. What's the second one?
And then we've got polywork. Now, this is a term that describes how full-time workers are using side hustles to explore new career options. And it has had 4.2 million views on TikTok.
Wow. And that was just when the word suddenly appeared in the kind of hemisphere. So thinking about Gen COVID, you know, we're keen to have more in real life interaction because they say they suffer from a fear of missing privileges. So that's quite an interesting way to look at their presence in work, to see that if they're not there, they are somehow missing out on promotion, missing out on opportunity, but also missing out on how they can contribute to the social structure within our workplaces and offices. And then the notion of expersonalization, which is about how 89% of people feel, I guess, disengaged with how they want to be treated in work, and also how they feel re-engaging is a key priority. But the question is, how do they do it?
Yeah.
And how do you help them to do it when you're engaging with them? Okay.
So this is a brief summary of the 5 states of work that we have highlighted in this report. And so the first one is about inspiration and intent. And this is used for assessing our work purpose. And that's followed by collaboration and culture, how we convene and collaborate. And then we have learning and leadership. And this is about making leadership a team KPI.
So that's interesting. It's not about leaders taking responsibility. It's the collegiate nature of how we develop leadership in the workplace.
The decentralization.
Decentralized Web3 and how we look at, I guess, that future of the 3 C's, collaboration, creativity, and a third one, surprisingly, conversation.
And that takes us to focus and flow, which is one of the most fascinating states of work that we've highlighted. And these are the collaborative mechanisms that create flow wherever we work. And finally, the rejuvenation and resilience. And this is so essential, but it's about using our downtime to reboot our systems.
So somebody was describing this as proactive relaxation, which I quite like the contradiction of it, in the sense that it requires us to fully commit to a sense of how we rejuvenate and how we reactivate. Okay, so that's a kind of a taster of the workplace. What I wanted to look at was this whole notion of collegiate nostalgia, which for those of us who went to college, sounds pretty familiar, but a lot of us, if you think about Gen Z, for example, a lot of them didn't quite make it or had issues about how they would get there, or were doing it virtually rather than the thing that a lot of them wanted to do, which I think was the issue of presence. One of our foresight analysts in the US, Carly Ettinger, was saying that a lot of the time you're seeing people wish for things that never happen. And a lot of this was driven not by reality or by their experience, but by television itself. Television creating not a false nostalgia, but I guess a kind of a fantasy nostalgia about college.
Yes, but I did remind her that, being Gen X, in the 80s and 90s, we kind of grew up on American college and high school life, and it's come back again. But there's a different twist to it. Not a twist, but there's a darker side, which we will get to.
I mean, I guess the images we're looking at is that classic Ralph Lauren view of kind of the preppy college, but also what you're seeing is how people are translating this using, for example, resale, using secondhand to reinvent and reinterpret. And again, because maybe the memory hasn't actually been physically experienced, and they're seeing ideals of what this collegiate nostalgia or sensibility could look like.
Or they're actually now questioning the college experience too.
I see where you're taking this, yes.
Yeah, so that's 40% of high school age Gen Z students were reconsidering where to go to college or whether they even wanted to go to college due to the uncertainties caused by the pandemic. And that's a stat from the Center of Generational Kinetics.
So it's not doubt as such, it's not hankering. In some ways, it's just the fact that they're seeing this as an uncertainty and they want to explore it. Because I guess, you know, if you think about terms like dorm living, in-person collegiate learning, fraternity, sororities, for one generation, these things are being regarded as somewhat toxic, people rebelling against them. But Gen Z are still seeing these as a rite of passage. You know, it's a way to define identity, to explore, to form political opinion. So again, I guess it's how you look at the subject in relation to the people who haven't quite experienced it.
Mm-hmm. And a recent study discovered that 65% of Gen Z students consider education as very or extremely important to their identity.
Shall I say the next one, which is the Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research, which is where that data came from.
Mm-hmm.
I always remind people that the great thing about doing the presentation like this is how we look at the sourcing of it and the content and the expertise. So we're just going to take you into a little bit of some of the things you're going to talk about in the main part of the trend when you read it online is the notion of the emotional economy, college culture, how that's being defined currently, and also how it's growing out and opening out into lifestyle offers. So, first of all, I think Gen Z, this association of understanding their loss and their grief. Yeah. Okay, so it's where TV, where current fashion shoots, where a lot of reality TV programs we're seeing are using these senses of loss and grief to validate feelings in a different way. So it's promoting a positive image.
Yeah. But there is a positive message there.
Okay.
And that must come across is that they have a lot to look forward to. And I think that message has been forgotten.
Because I think that some of the stuff we're going to be looking at has the dark tinge to it, the shadows. And I think to your point, and I think what the team are covering, there is a bright side to it, but also there is the dark side, which I think as brands and businesses and organizations, we shouldn't ignore. So that was one of the points I think you brought out in the article.
No, and it's always that push-pull of trends as well, that you get that tension and navigating that tension is where you'll find the way forward. But, look at award-winning shows like Euphoria and don't be afraid to address those deeper, darker issues as well.
So I guess this kind of Mindy Kaling show, The Sex Life of College Girls, it really does absolutely go into, the hookups, character dealing with diversity, consent, loneliness, financial stress, and activism. But, and this is what I like about it does it through the clothes they wear to reflect each particular mindset.
So it's like the protagonist in Tell Me Lies, Lucy. It's the collared t-shirts, the cable knit sweaters, the low-rise jeans, and the Uggs. And they've received
Did you say Uggs?
I said
okay,
227 million views on TikTok.
It's slightly queasy when I hear Uggs, but absolutely, it's like Crocs, isn't it? It's how a generation takes it on and really embraces it. And I think the key thing we're trying to get across here is that it isn't just about fashion, because I think it started with fashion. And I looked at in one article I read, it said 380 collegiate fashions to conquer spring summer 2023 with, and it was going wow. But actually when you think about it, it's also about food, it's music, it's travel, it's the notion of how we rethink romance, sorority, so all of those things, the adrenaline. As somebody said, the college campus face-offs between jocks and nerds would make in itself a whole theme to recreate for the coming summer. I think that would be my bet. That would be my bet.
So this is when we move on to the anti-provocation platforms. And there's a quote here from Sue Fennessy, who's one of our Futures 100 experts and the founder and CEO of We Are 8. And she says that social technology can only function effectively when the economics are benefiting the people. And absolutely so. We've got Zuckerberg here and we have the metaverse. And it's that idea of, well, is there a use case for it yet? Have we reached that point? But the promise of social media has long been connection and expression and community. but consumers still predominantly experience digital platforms as hostile spaces, with a majority feeling negative after interacting online. And that's from the Cybersmart Foundation. But consumers, as our research suggests, aren't enthusiastic about the alternatives, and many of the proposed Twitter substitutes like Mastodon, Hive Social and Counter Social, they had a boost, or they peaked shortly after Elon Musk took charge, as people continue to search for more inclusive substitutes.
That's true, isn't it? Where that's the what I think people have called no hate platforms and no hate social media.
I keep on searching, but as Jasmine Enberg, the principal analyst at Insider Intelligence, put it, social media users are less willing to tolerate a degrading experience.
So I guess where previously it was inertia that caused a drop off, now people are proactively deciding that if it's not working for them, then they are pulling out. In fact, we've got a really good interview with Sue on one of our podcasts where she really looks at this in more depth as to how and why a lot of members on kind of social media citizens, as she calls them, expect rewards for creativity. I think you were saying positivity as well. And yeah, I think that I would love to be paid for is watching and commenting on ads.
Yeah, agreeing to do that. It's part of the partnership, the exchange. So a couple of case studies for you. There's Spoutable, which was created by Christopher Boozy, whose Bot Sentinel service has been analysing Twitter activity since 2018, identifying bots and flagging accounts engaged in disinformation campaigns. There's Somewhere Good, which is a community-focused social media platform created to be a safe space for people of colour and queer communities. And there's We Are 8, where users also get paid for watching adverts on the platform and can choose how much of the money they earn goes to charity. So the platform's ethos is geared towards generating revenue for charities and sustainability projects.
Which is quite impressive if you think about it, that you're committing and I think the other thing I discovered from chatting to her, she was saying that when they actively find people who are issuing hate statements, they're removed straight away. There isn't that kind of I guess area where it's a grey for a moment. Do we debate it? Do we get rid of them? Do we leave them? They just take them out. And a lot of it is self-managed by other users who are calling out people who are focused on hate rather than supporting each other.
So here are a few strategic opportunities from this trend that you could maybe take away and think about. And the first one is about prioritizing well-being. So social media consumers are seeking these anti-provocation platforms because they're burnt out on online negativity and hostility. So focus on healthy connection and ground your digital space as a brand in values of inspiration, community, and joy.
I like that third one, joy. I think it's a word that we'll talk about it when we get to awe, but joy and awe, two of the terms that have hugely come back into
and the other term,
last year.
Decentralized. So decentralized spaces. The one-size-fits-all approach to social media doesn't hold here now. So in order to find fulfillment, consumers will seek niches to hunker down in.
Wow. Okay.
And post-purpose, really, don't shy away from purpose. Create spaces driven by utility. Consumers are keen for social media platforms to feel good. So offer meaningful reasons to gather.
I mean, it's interesting that we sort of have talked about purpose, and a lot of brands have tried to move beyond it. And I say at the moment, a lot of people haven't really committed or understood purpose in the way I think we do it. And one of the again, people I was interviewing recently was a guy called Dasher Keltner, who's co-founder of the Greater Good Science Center at the University of California in Berkeley. And he was talking about awe, and he was saying that it's hard to think of a single thing that you can do for your mind and body that's better than a little dose of awe. So to that point about joy, he was saying that when you think about awe, when you use the term, it automatically activates in your headspace a sense of awe. And strangely, as we discovered, it allows you to excrete chemicals which induce awe. So if you think about that, if I'm feeling joy and I'm seeing it, I'm somehow also beginning to release the things that make us, well, feel joyful or can we feel awesome?
Yeah.
Okay, so these are the points I think the awe economy, as we've covered it on the network, really wants us to consider. Ivy Ross, who's the Senior Vice President at Google for hardware, and Susan Magsamen, who works at the International Arts and Mind Lab at Johns Hopkins, also say it's not just understanding now how it happens, we're understanding why and how it happens. So what they have used are fMRI scanners, I better get that right, the science right, to demonstrate how key chemicals, so think about this in your brain, dopamine, happiness, oxytocin, bonding and love, endorphins, which allows us to feel buoyant, but also reduces pain in the system. How these are triggered is a good word. I like that word. Key sounds, key shapes, key colors and textures. So what they're saying is the science of neuroaesthetics or neurodesign needs to be revisited, because now we understand what sits beneath and how we potentially can activate parts of the brain using key references and tools. So, I mean, what do you think is a musical note that creates the most joy and awe? There's a good question.
I have no idea.
See, I didn't either. And when,
as a piano player, I'd say middle C.
Yeah, well done. It's absolutely bang on. It is C and G. And what they were saying is when you get these combinations, when you play them and when you release them in certain orders, you can create joy and awe. So think about the store, think about the product. This is where quite a lot of brands are now utilizing these things to reactivate how we engage with the world post-COVID.
And if you're New York based, there's an image that we showed a couple of slides back there. Do go to the Met Museum, where the artwork by Refik Anadol that we featured there is now in the lobby there, and it is drawn entirely from the artworks in the museum and also the surrounding atmosphere. So just stand and absorb that, and you might understand what we're talking about.
And it is that smell and the sound and space that creates these things. So the Museum of Art, which is one of the case studies we feature, is really designed to help unlock serotonin and oxytocin by synchronizing heartbeat, so our heartbeat with that of a shark. So using nature as a way of triggering these things in a particular way. I mentioned nature, but also I think a lot of people understand how biophilia, this notion of surrounding ourselves with trees and plants, actually releases awe in a different way. Why? Because of terpenes. The trees are actually excreting a particular molecule that invigorates and enlivens us in a different way. So again, it's just using the natural senses of things around us, and also how we immerse ourselves. You know, not just in nature, but using, everybody says, what is the benefit of the metaverse? Well, if you apply awe to it and you use sound, for example, you use color, you use what they call dimensionality, and I don't mean about 3 dimensions, but the sense of traveling through time and space triggers a lot of these chemicals in our head. So suddenly we're going, wow, there's a whole science out there that allows us to feel joy and I guess other things in a different way.
Yeah,
that's just
a nice
there.
Next level hedonism. So there's a quote for you here. Everyone is in the mood to embrace the wild escapism of the early noughties. Sartorially, that energies translate into an exhibitionist kind of glamour with a hint of club sleeve. And that's from Lauren Santo Domingo, who's the founder of Mode Operandi. So after experiencing some of the most stringent regulations during the pandemic, nightlife events are on the rise. So we've looked mainly at LA and New York here. And this shift is prominent among Gen Z and millennials, the zillennials. but even some of the Gen Xers are in there partying hard. And this is despite the fact that Gen Z are drinking less than earlier generations, with some even naming them the soberest generation in history. So this is that push-pull again.
Yeah, we have Ruby Warrington to thank for that, who created that term sober curious. And she's actually featured in one of her podcasts where she's looking at women without kids, because she reckons that also, as well as a lot of people not drinking, next generation are choosing actively not to have children for different reasons, some of which are about the planet, but some of which are about people celebrating the sense of being liberated.
Oh, they just need more sleep.
They need more sleep. Okay, so I just thought she, again, worth listening to her podcast on that subject.
One of the big examples of this was the California-based streetwear brand Born and Raised. So they recently held their annual Sadie Hawkins Winter Formal, which invited LA's creative community to forget about the world's problem for one evening. How wonderful. Indeed, I'd love to. And then there's this guy who, running out of room in his dorm for his 50+ guests, the 19-year-old entrepreneur Quincy Davis asked to place hairstylist barbershop into one of New York's hottest underground dance parties.
I'm wondering how big his dorm was, or how small are his friends. He's trying to get 50 people into those kind of rooms. Wow,
he got the party started.
Impressive.
That's for sure. So again, here are a few opportunities, takeaways for you. So there's this idea of the roaring 20s and a push-pull counter trend to the sobriety movement. And so the potential of a post-pandemic roaring 20s like that in the last century has often been mooted and discussed. And it is, of course, matched by similar economic disparities and rising instabilities. So we may yet still see this happen.
I think Babylon, the film, was probably a great example of that roaring 20s and the hedonism that was coming through in kind of visual culture and in party culture. And I was speaking to a lot of I guess baristas developing drinks, and they said suddenly it's either drinks about health or abstemiousness, or it's drinks about overloading to the point of, to use the term this guy described as terminal vomiting, which was a cocktail, would you believe? Is actually the name of a cocktail. So I was going, wow, that's what you do in LA.
So with the rise of in-person events comes a white space opportunity for food and drink brands, both alcoholic and no and low alcohol, to promote their physical products to partygoers through sampling, which is a favorite marketing touch point for Gen Z. I
was kind of surprised at that, because it's such, in some ways, it's almost 3 generations back, but now the notion of getting things free and testing and giving advice and commentary on, it's, I guess, very Gen Z.
Yeah, and this is also where we go back to this idea of the all economy. But as young consumers are really eager for unique real life experiences, tech brands, you can collaborate with events by integrating innovations. We've seen 360-degree glam cams in photo booths or LED video walls, and they're creating these experiences in line with this all economy idea. It's all about location. Discover new hotspots to host events that will excite and engage audiences.
Yeah, it's funny how in the workplace, we're having that debate about how won't we return to work? But in the social sphere, in the social realm, our cities from 5 p.m. onwards are rammed. So we're beginning to see also a different sense of how we calibrate the notion of city, the notion of socializing the city, and also where we're willing to kind of separate both the office from our personal and kind of lifestyle activities. Just to remind you, the trends we just sampled, they are just samples of the trends, because on the network they're in much more depth, with a lot more of the expert insights there with them. But you can find them on, it's lslglobal.com. But we do have a little time to answer questions. So I'm going to try to take us out, because I know you're better at this than me. Every time you do it, it works. Every time I do it, I manage to fail it. But there we go. Look, there we are. So if anybody had questions, I know there was one question that came, well, actually it was 3 people asking the same question, was really about how these trends, are we talking nationally, or are these trends specific to states and regions? And if so, how do we on the network manage to make those distinctions?
Yes, and I think it's a question I've heard after, you know, almost 20 years working in the trends sector and focusing on the US as well. And I know I lived in North Carolina myself. I know that you cannot generalize about the US. And yes, we look at the hubs, the hotspots, you know, on the East Coast and the West Coast, but it is a very complex country. But what we've done here is we've just taken some of the trends that even apply to Europe globally, to just say that these are broad trends that will also affect your market. But on LSN Global, we will go into much more detail about the specific needs of those brands and businesses operating in the US market.
I mean, it's interesting. It's quite a lot of people are, you know, looking at, as we find, people looking at the States, what are the trends that we are going to take into Europe? So the collegiate nostalgia has become quite massive here. Like prom culture wasn't something that was particularly well known in the UK or in Europe. It was then brought in from America and then really built into sales system across people's years. So suddenly it's become a huge part of it. The collegiate nostalgia trend, both in terms of fashion and food and lifestyle, is a huge one that's been bought into here. But I think one of the trends that most surprised me was on the luxury end, despite the cost of living. And this is, I think, one of the questions that came through from, I think it was Alexa's, Fisker Kennedy at Tiffany, is how will luxury fare? And I think what has, well, I don't think it's come as a surprise to any of us, that it has fared well. It has become more gilded, more exclusive, more about gated access, and that high end, that kind of 1 to 4% of people spending a lot on luxury moments.
They seem, you know, invincible to the fluctuations, and that's where the security has been with those very important clients and catering to them. But we've also looked as well at how luxury brands are now shifting to start attracting Gen Z. So there's a great report on the site at the moment about top-line tableware and this revival of very traditional, formulaic, ritualistic tableware, from crystal to silverware.
I mean, I was amazed, Lord, when I read the report. I was looking at the napkin rings, which I'd forgotten about completely. Sales of napkin rings at LVMH, so looking at Dior, for example, who saying in homewares, had become astronomical. Linen, like again, thinking about the, you know, formal napkins. So all of those things that we slightly had put to one side, coming back in again. And I always think it's looking for the blip in those shifts that really give you a higher indication of what culturally is happening. There was another question.
There was one, we had a question from Mercedes Diaz about how can a fashion brand create valuable physical brand experiences this year?
That's what do you think?
It's the $1 million question, isn't it? But, you know, this is one that when I'm asked a question about retail, I always go back to the basics of having a really frictionless experience. And by that, I mean, we want the omni-channel approach has you know, long been talked about, but now I think we're talking more about omnipresent, and really these experiences that wrap around the consumer wherever they are, but they're also becoming more a part of it as well. So we interviewed a great guy in San Francisco who is really looking at Web3 and decentralized models to create a platform that retailers could use that marries the digital and the physical experience. So it's about building community in a whole new way that is more akin to kind of ownership. And that's scary for a brand to say that, but it's really not scary as it sounds. But I think, you know, please always check how frictionless is your retail experiences. But in general, I mean, the physical experience, you know, it is been for so long more about entertainment, but never forget the value of really good service, whether that comes through your digital or your physical offer.
I mean, it was interesting because I was looking at with one of the questions was about US travelers returning, post-COVID to Europe. What were the things that they were looking at? And what certainly we discovered is that high-end, more expensive, more costly, not just because of the strength of the dollar, but because of the level of service and the experience being offered. I was interested to see that Dior, for example, which now has its flagship store on the Avenue Montaigne, which is a bit more like a kind of a social club, outgoing. Their single apartment per night was coming in at an average $25,000. And they were saying that the majority of people who had booked it came from the US. So I also think that the notion of how service ties into experience and how you can activate that experience, because one of the I guess
they're acting as a cultural navigator for their consumers as well.
And
that's part of the gilded, not just golden, but part of a guild, a unique group. How that comes in when you the brand experience widens to be more than just the product.
To do it. So I mean, that was just another question here about we talk about neuroaesthetics, and to say that word right, and neurodesign. And one of the questions is about
great question.
like the smell, power of scent, and also how memories and transportive emotion of scent make a difference. Can it make a difference in new realities? And I can tell you, yes, it does, because we work with a lot of fragrance companies like Firmenich, for example, looking at flavors and fragrances, looking at brands that are developing smells. And what you can now do is understand which smells trigger which particular emotion. So previously it was not guesswork, I won't use that term, but it was where the science was imprecise on it. And now you can pretty much work out which parts of the brain are activated when you smell burnt orange, when you smell apple, when you smell tuberose. And I think what you're now beginning to see is next generation fragrance developers and noses to be able not just to actively engage the senses, but to do a lot of what I think the hedonism side was looking at, is how you trigger chemical releases in the brain that are almost like natural highs. And that was one of the things when I spoke to Ivy Ross, and when I was chatting to Dacker, he was saying that it's now taking us closer to the legal hallucinogenic market, which, as he said, is one that luxury has started and probably more able to exploit because of luxury's association with texture, with color, with smell, with richness. So I do think that a lot of the things that we're seeing coming through as early days trends, we'll start seeing coming through in retail and in luxury and in travel and hospitality first. And then I think other brands will start kind of buying into it.
Have we got time for one more question?
I think you could probably do, I can't read that. My contacts, so
where do alumni organizations fit in or are viewed as a part of collegiate nostalgia? I think this is really interesting because this goes back to our approach as well. When we look at demographic groupings and sometimes they actually can create quite big problems. We see, well, that's typical of Gen X or that's typical of Gen Y. But I think we've got to start looking more at what unites us and divides us. And I think when you look at these alumni organizations, it's a chance to turn back to those younger than us and offer a helping hand and actually find the common ground and the opportunities for that. But also probably just turning back to that time in our youth and a time when we actually probably could have done with people turning back to us and helping us more. And
I guess not to the realities are that we imagined the past was either better, like, oh, actually, if you look historically, the past was never better. But also, the great thing about nostalgia is that you can reinvent it and reinterpret it. And the question with, I guess, any alumni organization collegiate groups, campus models, is if they were seen to be retrograde and not particularly pleasant for certain groups, like as a gay person, as a woman, whatever, to be part of, that it's now the chance and the time to reinvent and reinvigorate. And I think Gen Z, because it has that great ultimate ability to not just dress up, but to readdress the issues, can be the group, despite the fact that they may never have been there, can come back with nostalgia that appeals to a wider gender and wider demographic than perhaps the ones that used to be part of it and wearing the sorority ring, which now has so much taint and I guess badness associated with it. Or is that just me?
Well,
okay. Right, well, I think that's all we have time for today. You can find out more about the trends on LSM Global. Fiona Harkin, editor, is always there, as am I myself, to answer questions and to direct you to the right people if we can't help you. But thank you again for joining us. And if you are about in March, you can join the Work States macro. I guess it's not an unveiling, but it's an unveiling. It's really showing you what the future of work could look like. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.